There you go.
Oh, there you are. Good morning and welcome. It's a pleasure for UNITAR to have you here today. This is the continuation of the Columbia series on mediation, multilateral negotiation, and leadership. Professor Alex Carter has been kind enough to leave us with one of the best experts in the field, Professor Rebecca Price, who is the director of the Alternative Dispute Resolution, ADR program of the U.S. District Court of the Southern District of New York. Nobody better than her to continue with us for the upcoming events. And of course, you know, the Columbia team, Alexander, Brendan, Gohard, Heli. Then we have Kevin.
Sky, yes.
Sky, well, I'm sorry. Samuel and Sonia. So welcome, happy to have you once again with us. I was telling Rebecca how busy we have been all these last 2 months. We have 3 major conferences that accumulated thousands of people in these venues. One was the Law of DC, which ended with a very good legislative idea of how to manage the high seas navigation and exploitation, something like that. It's called BBNG. It's time for the beyond the national jurisdiction of the right of the state, how to do that. So they were the delegates that were there for 3-4 days until 3-4 a.m. in the morning. Just last Friday, we concluded the Convention of the Status of Women. I never saw so many women in my life. So I was, and so they also there ended last Friday in the morning, early in the morning. Just getting these international framework conventions agree is pretty tough among delegations. Different interests, different state of development. The famous phrase, one size doesn't fit all, here is alive every single day. And as you saw when you were coming, they are preparing the famous water conference. There will be about 8,000 people in the next week and 1,000 events to which we organize. So for us, having these events are extremely important because they led to understanding the process of multilateral diplomacy, how to listen, how to negotiate, how to lead the conversation, and things like that. So we are very grateful for the program with Columbia University support on this. We are going to talk about a very pressing issue today, antiracism and peace building in conflict resolution. And talking about conflict is useless for me to explain what is happening in Europe or what is happening around the world. So I'm going to stop here. I'm going to welcome you and then lead in the interest of time to Professor Rebecca. And then do we have like 60 people online? 74. This is the COVID heritage. We moved to what we call it hybrid format. People in the room trying to protect each other and then be responsible, but at the same time, open the doors for those who wanted to follow or anything like that. So 72 over there, about 40, 50 here. I guess we make the numbers, something like that. So welcome, enjoy, participate. That's crucial, participate. If you do not participate, then it's not that it's not good, but these are very interactive processes. You need to do a kind of gamification among yourselves. You have to do exercises, something like that. That's the trade of Columbia University. So I'll stop here. Sadly, I have to abandon you. But Pelayo, my team will be with you all the time. Reem, Martina, Pelayo, and Nawal are here. So just approach them whatever you may need. Rebecca, to you. Thank you very much for being with us, and a pleasure to meet you.
You too. You too.
Please.
Okay. Hi, everybody. First, let me just offer my deep thanks to Marco for his kind introduction and his warm introduction, and for UNITAR's commitment to continue this collaboration with Columbia's mediation program, which has been going on successfully and fruitfully for many, many years now. It's a great honor for me to be part of that this semester and to get the chance both to work with Marco and Pelayo and Rim, but also all of the students and all of the attendees. A warm welcome to those of you who are online and participating. We all were online a couple of years ago. We know what that's like. I just want to encourage your participation here today from wherever you are attending. As Marco said, this is meant to be an interactive presentation. There's certainly some content we will provide to you, but a big piece of the learning here will come from small group discussions that are going to take place. We understand that the concept of anti-racism itself, the concept of peace building, all of these things are very culturally specific, and we know that you come from lots of different places and countries which have their own unique engagement with things like race and racism and peace building itself and conflict. So we've really tried to create a presentation that allows for all of the differences that are natural amongst ourselves all over the planet, and to bring those differences into these conversations will make them very, very rich. So I want to encourage you to participate. I want to really thank the students who are doing the presentation today. We also have some students here who are going to be observing and participating, and hopefully will be doing future presentations. Brenton Brown, Kevin Cryan, Sky Lee, Sasha Youssef, Sonia Helen Pascal, all retooled this program specifically for today. So there's been a lot of continued effort. This is a presentation that's evolved over time. I'm excited to see what this iteration is going to be. And without further ado, oh, wait, let me just also thank Alex Carter, who was mentioned by Marco, but of course is the person who typically runs Columbia Law School's mediation programs. She is currently on sabbatical, which is a beautiful thing. We wish her all the best there, and we're delighted to be able to keep this going while she's doing all the good things that she's doing on her own. So thank you. One more, Rim, I understand, is going to be voicing the questions that come in over the chat. So folks who are remote, you will have a voice here, actually, and we'll also be able to see some of those questions that come in. We'll try to integrate them as much as possible. Without further ado, I'm going to pass this along. Thank you, Marco.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Cryan, and I'll be starting today's workshop. So we have three main goals for today's workshop. And the first thing that we're going to do is identify the ways in which race and racial bias manifest in conflict resolution. The second thing, we're going to examine the role of a leader in navigating these issues of race and racial bias to provide access to justice for all. And then finally, we're going to discuss best practices for situations in which identity-based bias may emerge. So this is what we're going to try and accomplish in today's session, and we have a little icebreaker for you. The main goal of this icebreaker, of course, is to get you talking, get you to know each other, but it's also to help you unlock your prior knowledge, because a lot of people come into discussions like this with experiences and things that they know, and we like to start there. So the question is this. Have you ever observed a conflict where you believed a racial, religious, or cultural identity-based bias played an underlying and unspoken role in driving someone's decision or behavior? What were the circumstances, and what, if anything, did you say or do? Now, I used to be a teacher here in New York City, and when we were dealing with emotional or personal questions like this, I like to use an activity called a think, pair, share. And here's the way a think, pair, share works. First, I'm going to ask you to think quietly about how you would answer this question to yourself. I'm going to take about 2 minutes for that. Next, I'm going to ask you to pair up with the person next to you or the people who are around you, and just discuss your answers in that smaller, safer environment. And then after a couple minutes of that, we're going to share out as a full group. Now, I want to be mindful that we have a lot of members on Zoom, and it's very difficult to have the people from Zoom pair up. So I'm going to try and do it like this. We're going to make it a little bit shorter. We're going to do 1 minute of thinking, 2 minutes of pairing, And so people on Zoom, let's say 3 minutes just to think quietly to yourselves, and then we'll all share. I'm going to try and prioritize talking to getting answers from Zoom and from online during the share portion to make sure there's a little more quality there. Great. So take 1 minute and let's think, and then we'll pair up. Those of you in person, take a moment, about 2 minutes, turn to the person next to you, the people next to you, and start to share out in that small group how you're answering this question. Those of you on Zoom, take about 2 more minutes to think quietly to yourselves. All right. I'm hearing some wonderful, wonderful conversations. I want to thank the people on Zoom, technically WebEx, for their patience. Let's try and wrap up our conversations in, let's say 5, 4, 3, 2.5, 2, 1.5, 1, half.
Order.
But no, I think it's really wonderful. I think it speaks to the excitement we have in the room, the wonderful level of participation that we have here, and the depth of kind of knowledge, experience that we have in the room and on Zoom, right? Everybody has something, some story they want to share that means something to them. And that's really what we're here about. So thank you to everybody on WebEx for being so patient. Thank you for everybody in the room for having such great participation, and I'd love to see us share. So if you're on WebEx, if you raise your hand, if you use the raise hand function, I should be able to see you and then call on you. If you're in the room, you can physically raise your hand, and I'll call on you as well. If you're on, last but not least, if you're on WebEx and you don't feel comfortable sharing out, you can, of course, put something in the chat, and we'll read it out. So thank you to everybody, and let's get this share started. For the people who paired up, what did your pair talk about? For the people online, what do we have? Okay, Sanum, you can unmute and share. Thank you for raising your hand.
Hello, how are you all? This is Sanam Habibullah Kabru, and I am chairperson of a non-profit organization. In December, I was at Karachi, and there I met a social activist, and he was working with the human rights from Lahore. We met in some leadership program. While we were sitting at the dinner table, he got some messages from a hostel from Lahore. Some boys, he was a Hindu leader. So in a Muslim majority country like Pakistan, he shared that he received the message that a few Muslim boys are harassing a Hindu boy. So he said that he has been harassed because he was in contact with a girl. Like the students at university, they usually interact with each other. So he didn't tell that girl that he is a Hindu. So he shared with her, interacted with her, being a same religion person. So he didn't tell her. So when the girl realized, she shared, and then they felt that she also felt that he harassed her, and then the things spreaded. It was a misconception. So group of boys came and they harassed him. So you know that in Pakistan, blasphemy law is something where most of the times the people who are from other religion, they cannot justify, they cannot share that they haven't committed the crime of blasphemy. So they threatened him that they will put the blasphemy law on him. So he was in a problem, and he was constantly facing this harassment for 2 months. So when he shared with me, I told him to go and file this complaint and tell the exact problem to the police and take the help of the girl. He can actually say sorry to her, and then they can actually solve this problem by talking to each other, like the girl also. So he said that the girl don't want to come in front. I suggested him that if he will complain before they go and complain blasphemy law on him, they complain that he has committed the blasphemy, so it will be difficult for him. So right now he can go and to the police and to the human rights department. He can file a proper complaint, and if he will do that, he will get the protection of harassment. In the early stages, if someone is going and telling that what is going on with him, so the authorities know and he will get protection. So at that time, he took my advice and he filed the complaint with the human rights committees and with the police as well. He got the protection, and they took the girls interview as well. They took his side also, and then this is how the case came into the officials' papers before the other party could come and attack him. Thank you so much for listening. That's it from my side.
Sanum, what a story. Thank you so much for telling us everything about it. I really appreciate you going first. I really appreciate how you brought up the religious bias and everything, all the detail you brought to that. Thank you so much. Does anybody else like to share? Maybe somebody from inside the room this time? Yes, hi.
Is it okay? Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Kevin. And first, I want to introduce myself. I am an intern now, currently work in the UN DGC Youth Office. So I have a perfect example of this regarding this bias. I remember that last month we have the office party, and because I'm an intern, so I find a person who had a permanent position in this UN system. So I asked some questions to him about how he got the position here. So I remember that time he just told me that don't be hardworking like an Asian, and be smart. And I think he said this because in some general opinion, Asian people are just too hardworking, that they might be overexploited by their bosses, and sometimes there is a potential opinion that they don't know how to present themselves. So that time I said to him that everyone should be hardworking and be smart at the same time. This is not regarding their racial identity. This is just that everyone should do, they should do. So yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. There's a lot to unpack in that story. It was fantastic, and I think we're going to get to a lot of the themes you've identified. So thank you so much for sharing. All right. I'm mindful of the time, so I do want to make sure we move forward. I hope we feel a little bit like the ice is broken. So now we're ready for the deeper questions, right? As we dive into a discussion about anti-racism in the peace building and conflict resolution process, we want to make sure we're all thinking generally on the same page about this question of what is racism. I'm going to say that, when we put this together, we're working off of this definition, but we invite people who feel that if there's anything missing from this definition, or if there's anything that you might change, then to please let us to talk about it. So we're defining racism as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism by an individual, a community, or institution against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. Now, as you might imagine, this sweeps very broadly. I'd like to take a moment, see if there's anybody who wants to raise their hand on WebEx, put something in the chat, or raise their hand in person, and see if there's anything you want to add or modify, or even just kind of bring to light within this definition. Yes.
For me, there's a difference between racism and prejudice, right? So, me, I find that racism is the impact of racism is that you use, it's from the dominant culture. And I don't know, I mean, if I have to be diplomatic or whatsoever, but when you are racist or you act in a racist way, is the person on the end of it, the impact is that they lose more than if you're prejudiced only, right? It's at a deeper level. So I don't agree in the definition of prejudice, and I would take out the prejudice part of it.
All right. Thank you so much. So you're saying, just in case the microphone didn't pick up the beginning, that that you would separate racism from prejudice, and that prejudice is something deeper. Racism is something deeper.
Yes, because it's a power dynamic that you have in racism that in prejudice you don't necessarily have.
Fantastic. And actually, we're going to explore that theme a lot today. So thank you for bringing that up. Remind me, what's your name? Mitzi. Nice to meet you. All right.
We do have someone commenting, Pezu. They said, I would omit the typically one that is a minority and is marginalized, because there's many examples where we have seen that this is not always the case.
That is a fantastic thing to amend, absolutely. And I think this goes to so thank you so much for bringing that up. Right? It doesn't have to be a minority. Sometimes even the minority exhibits racism flagrantly. And so again, if we think broadly about what power is and what those power dynamics are, then we know that one doesn't have to be in the majority. So I'm seeing that in the comments. Thank you, everybody, for pointing that out, and I appreciate that. training programs that an organization might implement to increase and create a more inclusive culture and bring about positive change. These are diversity awareness, cultural competence, and anti-racism. And we might think of these as three different tools in the toolbox of building a positive environment. They're each good in their own unique way. They each have some limitations. So, and they might each address differently things like individual racism, interpersonal racism, institutional racism, and systemic racism. Diversity awareness, for example, has some pros and cons, right? One of the nice things about diversity and awareness is that it acknowledges and respects differences. And an organization doing a diversity awareness training is going to really celebrate learning about a variety of different cultures. And it's going to develop sensitivity and understanding towards different groups. This is what it means to be diversity and have awareness of diversity. Some of the limitations, I might not call it a con, maybe a limitation, is that it only focuses on racism at an individual or interpersonal level. A lot of times the goal of a diversity awareness training is to present, diversity as a corporate or organizational asset. We should be aware of diversity because it helps the corporation or the organization in some way. And it does not have really the tools to address institutional racism, systemic racism, or more broadly, social dynamics. Moving forward, another tool in the toolbox is cultural competence. This will go beyond just awareness and really push the ongoing practice of cross-cultural learning, right? A cultural competence training will give you the tools to become a lifelong learner in this field. And specifically, it does that by encouraging personal introspection about how to engage with other cultures. Knowing what are the best questions to ask, asking yourself, what do I know that I don't know, and what room do I still have to grow? What assumptions maybe am I bringing to the table, and how can I challenge those assumptions? And that's really the goal of a cultural competence training. Again, it has some limitations. It doesn't really give people the tools to address issues of power, of privilege, or access through a critical lens. It doesn't talk very much about systemic racism. It also maintains predetermined assumptions about cultural beliefs and characteristics to create a sense of otherness, right? I come from one culture, others have different cultures. How can I learn about cultures that are different from mine? And so it can, teach cultural competence, but in a way kind of reinforce difference by doing so. And so getting into the heart of today's presentation, what is anti-racism? We're going to do a similar format as we did for what is racism. I'm going to present the definition that we use, and then I'm going to invite feedback from the people here in the room, from people on WebEx. You can either raise your hand, or actually it's probably easier if you put it in the chat, and we'll have this discussion. So the definition we're bringing to the table is this. Anti-racism is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism by changing systems, organizational structures, policies, and practices, and attitudes so that power is redistributed and shared equitably. So that, in this definition, is doing a lot of work. The goal of anti-racism is not just creating a corporate asset, it's about how power gets redistributed and shared amongst the people. So that is how anti-racism really differs in its goal, at least in our definition. A shorthand for this is that the opposite of racism is not non-racist, but anti-racist, somebody who actively tries to eliminate racism. So I'm going to open up the floor to people in the room, to people online, and we'll see what we have. A definition. So if there's anything you might want to amend, add, emphasize within this definition. I noticed Giselle on WebEx. Thank you for raising your hand.
so much. I just have an issue where we are experiencing, I'm Irish, in our country, a lot of racism at community level, simply because we are housing a huge amount of Ukrainian refugees, but we also have to take into consideration our other refugees and our other migrants and migrant workers. And we, unfortunately, are now under a situation where all non-EUs and by default EUs who appear on the streets to an Irish citizen in certain communities are being targeted, and it's become very serious here for us. So how do we educate at community level? Because it seems to be the education piece sits elsewhere. It's given to workers, and it's given to trainers, and it's given to politicians, but it's very much a fight for space at the bottom now at community level. We don't have enough houses. We don't have enough social welfare to pay for the citizen who is at the bottom of the scale, the unemployed and those who are facing pressure. So how do we implement this and get this policy to work at community level, where somebody who's born into a very working class situation with still a lack of education around this gets actually access to training and to information? Because I think that might change what we're experiencing and would help.
I really appreciate your response. I think there's a lot there. Two things I'd love to pull out. So the first is that you say we need to include the community level into this definition and really think about that. And I'm seeing in the chat somebody else is talking about changing the values, structures, attitudes, and behaviors. And I think that's also kind of dovetails into this, about how do we address community level racism. And then also somebody else in the chat mentions global racism, and so you also brought up that with the idea of refugees, that this is this is both extremely small, extremely personal, and extremely big and extremely global at the same time. So thank you for that. And then the second thing you mentioned is that this is about the distribution of resources. And so in our definition, maybe what we're saying is that it's too general to say that power is redistributed and shared equitably, but also that resources are as well. And resources are put to use in the best way. So thank you for that, Giselle. Anybody inside the room? And then otherwise, I'm going to call again online. All right, let's do one more comment from online. How do you think we pronounce that? Rishwe?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's move on to the next person. Thank you so much.
Okay, we do have Jasleen says racism is around us at all levels. I feel it needs to change even as simple places as in our classrooms. Another comment from one of the participants: I think that the goal of anti-racism is not only about power being redistributed, but for people recognize we are humans with rights that require dignity and right to live without fear of being judged. We also have, would you like to comment first before?
No, I just want to say thank you so much. That's wonderful. Let's maybe do one more, and then we're going to push forward.
Keith had mentioned, I think addressing racism begins firstly at home and then in educational institutions.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. So then, when we're thinking about the role of an anti-racist, we're thinking that an anti-racist person then understands that inequality exists not just on the individual, but also on the systemic and structural level. An anti-racist evaluates issues of unequal power and access from a broader societal perspective. And finally, an anti-racist addresses how existing practices, policies, and procedures underserve people of color and overserve white people. We felt this was important to put into our presentation, but again, as we've noted here in the discussion and in our icebreaker, that this is about power most broadly, and that this is about power most broadly. It can happen within majorities and minorities as well. So thank you so much. I'm going to pass.
So where is the action? Like I see the understanding, evaluate, and address this. Where is the action? That's the most important thing. Being interactive. Or am I too early to myself?
You're a little early, but thank you for bringing it up. Action is an important part of being an anti-racism racist because it's not a passive act, right? Being anti-racism is actively trying to end these barriers, and so action is a very important part. Thank you for bringing that up at this slide, and yes, we agree. Thank you so much. All right, now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague Sasha.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and coming to our presentation. So now we're going to talk about anti-racism in peace building and conflict resolution. So what exactly does anti-racism in peace building and conflict resolution look like, and why should we care? We want to embrace a work environment with diverse backgrounds, cultures, and viewpoints, actively identifying and confronting issues such as bias to promote inclusive negotiation and resolutions. And we also want to promote access to justice by supporting peace building and diversity, especially in the context of depolarization. And so the next, I have the clicker. We're going to talk about how does racism exactly show up in conflict resolution. So overt assertions of racial bias are the first thing we're going to discuss. That includes intentional or obvious harmful attitudes or behaviors towards a party because of their identity. And, again, like Professor Price said at the beginning of the presentation, we do acknowledge that this looks different depending on what culture that we're talking about. So this isn't meant to be an exclusive list of how racism looks like or the only ways that racism can look like. It is largely dependent on a particular culture, region, area, all these things. And so that could be race, religion, sexual orientation. It could be a bunch of other things. And so overt bias can manifest in direct prejudice, hostility, or clear negative feelings. Some examples of this are speeches or behaviors that demonstrate negative racial attitudes, such as racial slurs, and then the use of generalized negative attitudes or stereotypes directed towards groups. And then this also can result in institutional skepticism. Racial, ethnic, or religious minorities may have a lack of confidence in certain institutions. If they feel as if they are going to be prejudiced on the global scale when we're talking about the negotiating table or in solving, negotiations, conflicts. In the U.S., for example, general lack of confidence in the legal system, coming as a law student, because of historical mistreatment is an issue in the States. Over-sentencing, disrespect in the courtroom, overrepresentation and underrepresentation. When you go to a courtroom and you see 4 justices, 5 justices, 6 justices of one particular race or ethnic group, it is a lot of the times discouraging for those of us who are coming into the legal profession as people of color. And globally, peace building and conflict resolutions efforts may be hindered by structural inequality and doubts rooted in past mistreatment. So it's important to honor very real possible skepticism by being inclusive and perceptive. I'm going to hand it over to Sky right now to talk about barriers to communications.
Problems. People misunderstand each other for a wide variety of reasons. So I'd like to open it up to the floor or to the people on the call as well. What are some barriers to cross-cultural communications that you can think of? I'd take any hands, any quick-fire responses anyone might have.
Her hand raised up. Maybe
Julie,
you can take the floor, please.
Sure. Julie, would you like to unmute yourself and
Yeah, happy to. Tone or like diction when it comes to conversational nuances.
Definitely, tone is a very big one, and I really like that you pointed it out. It's often something that's quite missed. It's something that goes beyond mere like language barriers. I think tone is really important. I see there's an MJ Goldstein who also has his or her hand raised. Okay. Is there anyone?
Sorry, that had been me.
Oh, no, that's okay. Thank you for contributing, MJ. That was really great. Julie, I noticed your hand was raised, but was it raised from earlier or?
Well, actually, I can contribute to this as well. I don't know if it'll cover exactly this slide, but I'm an American and I've lived in Iran, and coming back to the U.S. Even though I attend Washington University and I've attended other institutions, having had the opportunity to travel to Iran, I find that there's a lot of bias and stereotypes that come across through the media about Iran and Iranian citizens that aren't necessarily completely true. And I'm constantly feeling the need to defend or correct others just because I've been there firsthand and I understand inside the country. Yes, there are problems, that we deal with Iran, but we also deal with problems with America and other countries. But the perception just that is fed through the media, I believe, is a real issue for racism and religious bias and cultural issues.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that story. That's really personal. Thank you, Julie. And actually, that brings us to the next point that we're going to talk about, which is that the most significant barrier to communication is the tendency of humans to stereotype, or more specifically, to categorize and make assumptions about others. This could be based on identified characteristics such as gender, race, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, age, or even nationality. Racial bias is often destructive of communication, which happens unconsciously based on the stereotypes that we internalize. This could be as blatant as job interviewers who reject certain candidates based on racial or gender stereotypes, or even just avoiding those who are culturally different from us, creating a sense of isolation amongst minorities. This is compounded by the fact that many of us are not effective in getting to understand the ways in which others may differ from us. When addressing these issues, the key concerns include labeling rather than describing issues, which leads to oversimplification, and also the silencing and sidelining of marginalized voices. So I want to expand and talk about this issue of implicit bias, as it's really an issue that compounds the impact of stereotypes on effective multicultural interaction. Unconscious stereotyping can affect our interaction with others and may also predict behavior. And this may be way more pervasive than we think. For instance, after tens of thousands of race IAT tests were taken, it was found that 88% of white people had either a pro-white or anti-black implicit bias. The impact this has on our justice system cannot be overstated. A study found that the race of a civil plaintiff or criminal defendant implicitly caused people to misremember a case's facts in a legally biased way. Also, a judge and gender IAT test showed that law students implicitly associate men with judges and women with paralegals, harboring an implicit male leader prototype in a legal setting. I think many of us would like to believe that we are open-minded and accepting, but in reality, many of us may experience discomfort when interacting with those who are different from us in terms of our values, our beliefs, and our behaviors. We may then evaluate these differences in a negative light, which is the essence of ethnocentrism. This is the evaluation of good and bad, right and wrong, relative to how closely those values, behaviors, and beliefs mirror our own. To suspend judgment and truly begin by trying to understand someone else's perspective is really much more easier said than done. So I like to open it up and have everyone the opportunity to interact in groups and describe the ways in which racism shows up in your community, your country, and your culture. So Sasha and I will give you a couple of minutes to discuss, and we'll also be monitoring the chat, and we'll all reconvene in a couple of minutes.
All right, we're going to come back together now. Thank you, everyone, for participating in the discussion. I think we want to get some. I think we're going to get some people to participate in the room first before we go on to the Zoom. So, does anyone in the room want to tell us about the ways that racism shows up in your community, country, or culture? Don't be shy. Anyone? Y'all were talking a lot. There must be something. Oh, we do? Nice. Yeah, you have to wait for it to go red, and then you can talk. There you go.
Okay, so with the fascinating discussion with my colleagues here, and we were talking about intersectionality, how it's not just a racial dimension that needs to be taken into account, but also socioeconomic level, as was pointed out, as well as things like ability and disability, right? And how all of these different sorts of variables inevitably affect a person's vulnerability or their privilege, the level of it. And in order to identify the proper policy, legal, and programmatic interventions to push the needle toward a better world, we need to take a 360 approach to understanding all these different vulnerabilities to identify the right solutions that can address all of these things in the best possible way.
Yeah, and I'm very happy that you brought that up, this intersectionality. And like we said earlier on in our presentation, one of the first things that Professor Price said is that racism looks different everywhere that we go. I'm just kind of monitoring the chat here, and some people have mentioned that even different regions have words that they use that are racist towards other parts of the regions in their country. Like, for example, I'm half Pakistani, and historically our families come from a caste system. And I've heard stories about friends also from South Asian cultures who are discriminated because of their caste that has prevailed even to today, even though largely the caste system doesn't, it's not as prevalent as it was before, but its roots are still everlasting. Do we want to get someone from online? I see a Jeneth with their hand raised.
Yeah, hello. I'm Janet from Ecuador. I'm myself indigenous, so one thing that I have seen is that
is there a way for you to speak a little bit louder? We're having a hard time hearing you in the room.
Okay. Can you hear me better?
It's better. It's better.
Okay, so one thing that I have seen is that in my institution, like people, they are not giving us their harder activities, but instead they are using us to show this institution as intercultural or inclusive by showing indigenous with their traditional clothes. So this kind of racism, right?
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenna, for sharing that. We also have MJ Goldstein.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to share. So I'm both myself am from Washington, D.C. I am a Black man as well as a religious minority. So ironically, and I've been working in the public sector for about 7 years, is that when I am, casually interacting, just socializing with, some peers within my community, it's it's still almost like you have to, kind of jump a hoop or break a barrier just to convince someone of a simple thought. Bad example, but I'll say cheese pizza is the best on earth. Run down all the reasons, and rather than it be a debate, just kind of get met with like doubt or skepticism. Whereas if I'm communicating with another example, I'll just say white American, they tend to be more open to just different ideas. Whereas folks within my own community, not necessarily with being of Jewish descent, but just within the Black community, tend to kind of be more skeptical or doubtful, until you kind of have to. I don't know what the best term is. I'd say just alleviate doubts, so kind of having to do a lot more work to convince someone of a simple idea. Whereas when I'm not interacting with folks, or I'd say, in interactions where I'm speaking across racial boundaries, simple ideas kind of can get across without much convincing as much. Thank you.
No, go ahead. Sorry. Oh,
I'd like to chime in on, if I may.
Sure.
This is Julie. I'm Jewish, and I'm very I'm from California, but I currently live in Missouri. And being Jewish, and I put it in the notes, I'm very careful, and I choose when and where to wear my Star of David for fear of being judged or having anti-Semitism acts towards me. I don't always feel safe wearing it. And that is just across the board, whether it's when I'm traveling or in California or in Missouri or anywhere of that nature, because it's a big problem still to this day, I believe.
In them facing discrimination, and people have been mentioning instances of discrimination based on appearance, accent, microaggressions because of the pandemic, and also unwarranted arrests. And also I see that Keith mentioned that it's also attributed in part to economic factors, for instance, competition for jobs and resources, cultural and historical factors, including colonialism and a legacy of racial and ethnic tension. So these things can really, the roots of these issues stretch far and wide, and it can be exacerbated by current politics as well. So I think let's move on to the next segment, where I'll be talking about two approaches to deal with this issue. First is the color blindness approach, and the second is the color consciousness approach. So the colorblind approach is the belief that racial group membership and race-based differences should not be taken into account when decisions are made, impressions are formed, and behaviors are enacted. On the other hand, a color-conscious approach is an approach that takes into account race-based differences as a means of more directly addressing the issues relating to racial inequities, biases, and discrimination. So first on the differences between the two. So the former, the colorblind approach, ignores race-based differences, while the color-conscious approach acknowledges and amplifies them. A color-conscious approach is an active approach to center everyone's lived experiences. And I'd just like to amplify something Victoria said in the chat earlier, which is that for members of majority groups or those that profit from existing racist systems, it is key to emphasize that there is no middle ground. If you are not anti-racist, you are enabling oppressive systems. And I just wanted to say thank you for bringing that up, because the key point we really want to highlight here is that not making a choice is still making a choice. So by not actively acknowledging race, one is defaulting to fostering a colorblind environment. So the second point, why prioritize a color consciousness approach? If we cannot acknowledge the problems faced by others and the imbalances of power, we cannot even begin to work to correct them. This is especially critical as mechanisms that perpetuate racism are becoming more covert in today's society. Ignoring them allows for people to perpetuate manifestations of discrimination. On the other hand, a color-conscious approach can give rise to a willingness to create change and also generate collective action that is more importantly sustained. Okay, so now we have a break for all of you before Sonia, Helen, and Brenton will delve into the specific tools that can help us to address some of the issues that we've been discussing so far. Thank you, everyone, for your participation.
Sky, how much time?
I think we should try to be back in the room by 11:20. This isn't
By 11:20. Okay, 15-minute break to grab a beverage, and we'll be back here.
and then.
Oh, you have a different thing than I do.
All right, everyone. So we'll be coming back together here shortly. Here we go. All right. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Brenton, and Sonia Helen and I will be talking about action or tools that we can take in confronting racism. And before I begin, I just want to say it's so good to see many familiar faces. I participated in the presentations last semester, and it's really great to be back here at the UN this semester. So we've seen what being anti-racist means, why it's important for us to practice anti-racism, and how racism may affect our jobs in resolving conflict. So now we're going to talk about what we can do to stop it, starting with what steps we can take to guarantee the quality of the process in confronting racism. So a leader's anti-racist role in conflict resolution. So here we see that there's a list of actions that we can take, ensuring procedural fairness, being aware of potential problems, promoting party participation, promoting mutual respect, and not being afraid to take active steps to combat racially charged behavior. So going down the list, the work that you put in before the conflict resolution process will help you become more alert to them in the moments you guide the parties. This will help you take affirmative actions like promoting party participation, which may be as simple as making sure everyone can have their say, or promoting mutual respect through skills like acknowledgement and stroking, which we'll be talking about soon, and giving you the courage to take the steps in combating racism. So this is really from the perspective of you being a leader and confronting a situation, a conflict, and how you can put some tools in place to confront that.
There we go. Thank you. Sorry for the delay, waiting for the mic to turn on. So we'll be going through a lot of tools in the next few slides. So to make this a bit simpler, we wanted to frame it in two ways. There's an inward and an outward bucket. So one of them is regulating your own biases, right? And then the other is regulating party biases. Say when you're in either facilitating the meeting as we do in mediation, or if you're just a part of the meeting, right? So in terms of the second one, I think this is where most of our tools will come in today, because it can be very hard to call out racist or prejudiced statements or attitudes in a meeting in a way that keeps the meeting moving. And so we wanted to give you some framing, how to frame this, and also some wording as well to present how one can go about regulating party biases in, say, like a conflict resolution meeting or series of meetings. So when you're regulating party biases, do not be afraid to take action. This makes it's a difficult balance, because I know when we're mediating, we want to put forth an impartial, neutral, we want to look impartial and neutral, right? And we don't want to have one party thinking we're taking one side over the other. So one way you can frame it is by saying, in order for me to feel like I'm conducting a fair and inclusive process, we can't use offensive and discriminatory terms to describe one another. So while you might be intervening on behalf of one party, it is potentially for the benefit of a party, but also for the benefit of the process itself. So that is one way you can frame it to make it seem like you're not being biased towards one party or another when calling out racist language for the benefit of the process as a whole. Also, one point when we were putting together this presentation that came up is that while our framework is mediation when we are not a part of the conflict, calling out other biases can also be a part of your framework when you are one of the parties, if you are one of the parties as part of a larger group, right? So you can use the tools that we're about to discuss for calling out biases within your group as well. So either across the aisle as a neutral party, or as a party on the side where there are members in your group maybe saying prejudice or racist things during the discussions, you can use the tools for all three of those scenarios. I'm going to just check the chat. Okay.
My experience is the opposite, not viewed as an African because of my facial features and skin color.
Okay. Oh, I see. So yes. Okay. Thank you for sharing. Okay, so next.
Thank you, Sonia Helen. So now I want to turn to acknowledgement and stroking, which are really two fundamental tools for a facilitator to use during conflict resolution to build relationships and reward beneficial behavior between the parties. I can tell you as a mediator that acknowledgement and stroking are our bread and butter. They're really, really useful tools. So acknowledgement is when a facilitator points out progress or productive move by one party to make sure the other party notices and processes it. This can include things like positively highlighting behavior, like acknowledging feelings, taking ownership of past mistakes, or expressing any degree of an apology. For example, if you have a party A who was previously offended by a party B and then says something to the effect of, "I shouldn't have said that," this would be a great opportunity for the facilitator to jump in and explicitly highlight that statement by saying something like, "Thank you, party A, for acknowledging that you shouldn't have said that word phrase." The goal here is really to make sure that party B hears and processes the progress that party A is making. And as a mediator, we come across this many times during mediation where you have two parties who have really opposed each other at the beginning of the mediation, but during the mediation, some work happens where they begin to sort of see the other side's perspective, and they may make a concession or two. And as the mediator, we really want to jump on those concessions, highlight them, because oftentimes when you're in a conflict, you don't really listen. You just, you're maybe filled with anger or emotion, and you don't necessarily process it the same as maybe a neutral outside party. And therefore, it's our job to really make sure that the other party hears what the party who made the concession said. Meanwhile, stroking is when the mediator praises a party for any positive behavior. You can stroke a party's civility, their self-advocacy, bearing with the process, or being more open-minded. I can tell you that I've seen stroking do some amazing things during mediation. For instance, in a mediation that Goddard here was a part of, at the beginning of the mediation, the party was very reluctant to participate in the process and actually wanted to end it. But through really effective stroking, thanking the party for their time, thanking them for just being willing to be a part of the process, Goddard and his mediator partner were able to not only get that party to stay during the mediation, but at the end of the mediation, that party actually offered Goddard and his co-mediator a spot at his business. So that just shows you how far stroking can take you. For example, if tensions are getting high or the parties are getting impatient, it can be useful to thank the parties for being there, for working together, and for being committed to resolving a conflict.
Oh, there we go. So why do we put these two tools forth in terms of ways to act as an anti-racist during these conflict resolution meetings? So I touched on this before in terms of how do you jump in and not shut another party down, making them think that you are biased towards one of the parties in the mediation. So by acknowledging and stroking both parties, it adds legitimacy to someone as a facilitator, because it shows that they are recognizing the mediator is recognizing the contributions of both sides. And it's important for people in these processes to not only trust the parties, but trust the process as well. The other reason we emphasize acknowledging and stroking is because it is difficult to hear someone you are in conflict with. Sometimes people shut down and cannot hear what someone is saying if they are very angry with them. So by repeating what someone just said, the acknowledgement, like, thank you for recognizing that that comment was not a great way to approach this process, right? Or thank you for recognizing that you could have handled this better, or handled, whatever it was, better. You allow the party both parties might be angry, but the party who cannot listen to the other party because of their anger, you allow them to hear it in a third party voice, which repeats it and allows them to think about it more and maybe hear it for the first time. So that helps prevent against people who shut down when they are angry, and could help move the process along more than just one person apologizing, but having the apology or the contribution recognized, just make sure it is heard by everyone in the room. Also, it highlights constructive behavior. So as Brenton mentioned, we had an example of stroking leading to a positive outcome in a recent mediation, right? So sometimes you stroke because you thank them, you recognize their civility or their time given to the process, because you as a mediator are genuinely recognizing their time given to the process. I know as a mediator myself, I have sometimes stroked constructive behavior that I would like to see and am not currently seeing. So sometimes by complimenting what you would like to see, you frame the parties to act more in that way. Thank you for not interrupting each other, right? If there's been a lot of interruption, but maybe there was a space where they didn't interrupt for a short period of time, you want to highlight that and compliment it so that going forward, people like being complimented, right? They want to act in a way that will get them praise. So by highlighting the moments, even if they're small, it can encourage people to continue acting that way more throughout the rest of the mediation. Also, as the mediator, we strive to model empathy for the participants as a way to make sure the parties are also being empathetic towards each other. So these tools serve multiple purposes and can be used in different ways, but we have seen multiple examples during our experience in the clinic as mediators of this encouraging communication between parties who are very angry with each other.
Thanks, Sonia Helen. So, a core to effective communication is having mutual understanding. And when you're in a situation where, there's maybe racism present, that can be difficult. But it's really important to understand intent versus impact. And, mutual understanding can mean, asking certain questions, such as, do I understand that statement or action? Can I communicate that understanding? Did they confirm that understanding? So if you have a situation where one person is using coded language or gestures, it leaves the door open for miscommunication and conflict. This is not ideal for peace building. And on top of it, when these statements are possibly racially or culturally insensitive, it adds a layer of anger or frustration. So you can use reframing, summary, and clarification to confirm that you understand what the speaker actually intended. So what are some examples? So during conflict, people say things like, off the cuff, some things that may be said or done without understanding the impact, and this can create confusion. Some insensitive phrases, connotations, innuendos are either misunderstood or not understood, while others are in fact said maliciously. So it's important to understand when something is said maliciously and when it's just due to maybe a lack of understanding. So in the US, for example, the thumbs up gesture, it's a good thing. It may mean you are both on the same page about something and are in agreement. But in other places, it means a quite different thing. It can actually be quite offensive. Another example is the okay gesture. In most English-speaking countries, this hand gesture means that everything is fine. However, in other places, it doesn't. For instance, in the 1950s, when Richard Nixon visited Brazil and flashed the okay sign to a waiting crowd upon arriving in Rio, he was greeted with boos. So when something like this happens, you can be left unsure of the meaning of what was said or done. So these tools really help you get to the bottom of it. So reframing, looping, or summary, and asking clarification questions can help you make sure that you understand intentions. And the goal of these techniques is to avoid misunderstandings. An easy option for you to do, or an easy question to ask is, what do you mean by that? This is simple. It's an open-ended question that gives the other party a chance to explain the meaning. Similarly, you can summarize or reword what the other person said and ask whether you've got it right. What I'm hearing you say, for instance, is that when you gave the thumbs up signal, you meant that we are on the same page and we have an agreement. Is that correct? Again, you confirming that understanding. Or, for instance, you could say, what I'm hearing you say is that when you gave the okay signal, you meant that everything was fine with you. Is that correct? Again, giving the other party a chance to confirm your understanding and giving them a chance to clarify if there was indeed malicious intent behind an action or a word that was said. From here, we are giving the party two avenues. Again, explaining if the intent is not malicious, or if we do find that there was malicious intent, these clarification questions can peel back the veneer or coded innuendos and help you understand what the other party means and how to go forward. You can also even further help them understand the impact of their words, knowing how hurtful and serious what they are what it is that they're saying, and having that on the table will let you see if that person will walk it back or perhaps stand firm in what they originally said or originally did.
Thank you, Brenton. I wanted to highlight something in the chat that we will be discussing in one of our hypos soon. Someone brought up a point about who's in the room and who are these facilitators. And thank you for bringing that up because we will be discussing it in a few minutes as well. And so to pick back up on where Brenton left off in terms of when you have something that is said where it could be taken either way during a mediation, you're not sure. The parties might also have it in their head. Did they mean that maliciously? Or did I misunderstand the intent, right? So kind of step one is, if it is unclear, is clarifying what that intent was. However, once that has been explored and it's clearer, either from a party's previous statements throughout the negotiations, or just based on the mood of the room, that the purpose was to create, the intent was to harm. It wasn't just a misstatement or something that was misunderstood because of cultural differences. It can be very hard to directly address the issue, right? And so we wanted to provide some tools on how to directly address that and some phrasing. So, for example, if one person references another person's race, gender, or ethnic origin in a negative manner repeatedly in a conversation, you might want to repeat their words back to them. When you say whatever the offensive thing they are, that they're saying is, you are saying that you believe X. And sometimes making someone confront explicitly what they're saying outside of the joke they're, couching it in may make them realize that what they're saying is not okay, right? So sometimes you can frame it like that. Also, you could say, you've come back to this phrase a number of times now. What is it that is important to you about this? Or maybe you've come back to the slur a bunch of times now. For the sake of the process, we will need to avoid derogatory language for the rest of this negotiation. So there are ways to call it out and frame it so that it puts the party on notice that this is not going to be tolerated as part of this negotiation, both for the process or the party they are trying to harm. So part of the reason that it is important to call these things out, and part of the reason we framed this presentation as needing to be active and not passive, right? So first we started talking about ways you can just generally encourage, like not good behavior, but good intentions throughout the process. Whereas now we're getting into what happens when you need to call things out, is because by being active, you relieve the parties from the burden of naming the issue. We've talked about power dynamics today, right? If someone is using a slur or using phrases that are intended to harm the person at the, across the table from them, is there a power dynamic at play that prevents the person across from them from naming the issue? Or maybe they're trying to get to a resolution. They don't want to harm the prospects of coming to a resolution by calling someone else out for their racist language. So that's why as a facilitator, it's important to relieve the parties from that burden of naming the issue and stepping in that instance. It also models appropriate framing and rhetoric, right? These framings that we've presented, these kind of tips for how to intervene, you're not being insulting while calling out potentially insulting behavior. So you maintain your impartiality, but you also communicate clearly what will be accepted and what will not be accepted during the process. And then sometimes you need to directly confront the race as the issue in order to move on with the process. Maybe it's not just a side issue. Maybe it's the issue on the table or so deeply affecting the discussions that you need to have a conversation, although uncomfortable, about race in order to get to a real solution. Back to Brenton. Oh.
All right. So, what happens when we have these conversations, right? Sometimes we'll have to have a one-on-one conversation to really address these issues head on, which can be, quite nerve-wracking, whether you're the party who's actually a part of the negotiation or a facilitator of the negotiation. One-on-one conversations can enable parties in conflict to explore more fully the needs and interests underlying their stated positions. But first, you have to evaluate whether you're in the position to pull someone aside to actually have a conversation that can move, the overall conflict resolution process forward. And you have to consider the benefits of more individualized conversations. And some of these benefits include venting and de-escalation. So racism and accusations of racism can elicit strong emotions, obviously. So a one-on-one conversation can provide a forum for parties to vent without further escalating high emotions, as they might happen in a joint session between all parties. Giving parties space to vent those emotions separately and de-escalate may be productive if it allows the parties to process their feelings. So in mediation, one tool that we oftentimes will use is something called a caucus, which is just another word for one-on-one conversation. If we are in a joint mediation and we see that there are, very strong emotions in the room, there's a lot of anger, and the parties really aren't hearing each other. They aren't really hearing each other. They're maybe calling each other names. We will separate them and talk to them individually. And that's a chance for them to sort of calm down, and it's a chance for us to talk to them one-on-one, because oftentimes parties might not share something, when the other party is present that they might share when you're alone with them. So we might ask the party, how are you feeling? And just give them a chance to be heard. In these one-on-one conversations, information gathering is also really, really important. The privacy of a one-on-one conversation provides the opportunity for information gathering, and this may be helpful in considering how the process should continue to unfold in order to best respect each party's self-determination. So information gathering is simply just, gathering the information, as the name implies, asking questions. For instance, as I said earlier, how are you feeling? What does a resolution look like here for you? If there's insensitive language that's been said, maybe something along the lines of, how are you feeling in response to the thing that party X did? Questions like this to just gather information, see if the conflict can actually, conflict resolution process can actually move forward, and the best approach to doing so. In these conversations, reality testing and coaching is also really important. You can provide the opportunity to reality test the use of language from the perspective of facilitating a meaningful communication. And these conversations can provide an opportunity to be more explicit about, the limits on language or conduct if there has been overt and intentional racism. For instance, we might say to a party who's using insensitive language, every time that you say this word, I can see on the other party's face that it was really offensive. And I don't think that we can really move along in this process if you keep using that language. Because ultimately, if two parties or any number of parties are at the table to resolve a conflict, that's the goal of the process, right? So for the sake of the process, I really think it'll be helpful if you didn't use this language. And as Sonia Helen said earlier, this really is useful because it takes the burden off of, you saying that, my offense to this is the reason why I'm pointing this out. Instead, you say it's the process. The process is why I'm pointing this out. We can't have a meaningful process if this language is used, these gestures are used. And I know that you care about the process or you wouldn't be at the table here today. And so for the sake of the process, I think that we should just modify our language. So the last thing that these one-on-one conversations can also really be useful for is providing caution to those parties. Everyone needs to be aware of their own biases, but some of us aren't. And the effect of one-on-one conversations, they can really have an effect on impartiality or neutrality, and they really allow the parties to perceive the fairness of the process and really sort of identify how their biases may be at play in coming to a resolution. And sometimes if they don't even know that they have biases, these one-on-one conversations can really just be a way for you to calmly and respectfully tell them that they do indeed have a bias that is affecting how they are actually going about resolving the conflict.
And I wanted to add something that about these one-on-one conversations that Sam and I were talking about during the break. We've noticed in the clinic that these one-on-one conversations can be very helpful for the reasons that Brenton just described, but also you might find that people are aware enough to know not to bring up certain language in a joint session, but they might feel more comfortable with you during the one-on-one session to say things that they knew were not okay, right, in front of the other party. So just as a note, be prepared during these one-on-one conversations to deal with more racially targeted language or microaggressions when you're speaking with the party one-on-one, because they feel more comfortable and they feel we explain when we do this caucus tool, there's an extra layer of confidentiality. So sometimes people feel protected to say things that they wouldn't say during the joint session, which is good in certain cases and not when it comes to racially charged language. So we've been talking about different tools you can use to help encourage a good environment for this process, even when racial tensions are at play. Also, how to intervene when they're disrupting the process, to see if there's a way to address the prejudice, racism, any kind of bias in the room. But also sometimes you have to think about, is it worth continuing this negotiation or is it time to step away? And this is not an easy decision. As we've been discussing, when something comes up that's related to race, that doesn't mean you have to stop the peace building process. These tools are being shared so that you have something to do when race comes up. But it does remain, at what point should you walk away? And think of it like any other power imbalance. When is it out of our hands as facilitators of the process of conflict resolution? As we mentioned before, you can directly address the issue at hand if you're comfortable or if you're well positioned to raise the issue. But at the end of the day, it is a balancing act. What are you comfortable with? You are in control of the process as far as what is allowed within the room. So you have to be evaluating at one point have I exhausted the use of these tools to prevent racial language from being used? It continues to be used. Is it worth continuing on with the process with both parties in the room or one-on-one if someone continues to use slurs or other racial statements? Power dynamics, as we've talked about today. Is anyone afraid to speak their mind because they've heard over and over again that the other party is disrespecting them based on race or other biases? Are you, as a facilitator, prevented from speaking your mind because of the power dynamics in the room? Are there cultural considerations or norms that impact parties' abilities to name race-based issues directly? Do you think that you can control and address the dynamic? And another question that came up during our Think Pair Share at the beginning when I was discussing with my pair, with Sam, was when Sam was leading a tour at the Tenement Museum, and the part of the point of the tour is to inform participants about the immigration process to the U.S. And someone in the audience took that as a moment to talk about how people from a religious group could never become Americans because they are a part of that religious group. So the question becomes, do you remove someone from the room? So not end the process, but another option, removing someone from the room in order to, just remove that bias if you don't think it can be addressed or fixed in the moment. Or do you allow that person to stay to learn from the discussion? And again, that's not going to be a yes or no answer for us giving you those tools, but just another way to think about it is, do I have to end the process? Do I have to remove someone? Or even if you are going through these questions for yourselves, another question is, do I allow this person, is the person disrupting the negotiation so much that I must remove them, or would it be for their benefit to hear from the other side and maybe learn a different perspective to help their own biases. Very complicated questions, but just providing these questions to provide a framework to think through these difficult decisions. So Sam, thank you for that story, during our share.
Sonia Helen, can I just pop in
Yeah.
for 1 second just to add that it also may be important for the recipient of that racist language to get clear about who they're negotiating with and who's part of this peace building process. So to some extent, I think that's another benefit that we sometimes are, and by sometimes we, I mean facilitators, negotiators, mediators can feel fearful about surfacing deeply held biased beliefs, because the concern is that by surfacing that, it's going to disrupt this peacemaking process or this mediation process. But in fact, what we're doing is we're allowing the recipient of that, all that negativity, to make a choice about who they are talking with, and to decide themselves whether or not they want to continue, if they have that choice, with this person. And just also to acknowledge that I'm sure in some of the situations that are happening within the UN, walking away may not be an option. There may be other overarching goals that require parties to stay at the table with one another. And I think the perspective here certainly is that understanding firmly the deeply held racist beliefs of the people at the table is better than pretending that those beliefs don't exist. It allows people to make as many choices as they can about that process that they must be engaged in.
Yes, because I think one of the things we talk about in the clinic a lot is raising our own thresholds for being comfortable with conflict, and recognizing that as the facilitator, it's not just about, I think I framed this last slide a lot in terms of the facilitator's comfort, but the facilitator's comfort with moving on with the conflict should not be about just their personal comfort. It's about their comfort as a mediation professional in knowing how these conflicts go. In term framing, the framework should be, should I end this for the benefit of the parties as well? So you're dealing with a lot of factors here in determining how to move forward, which tools to use, when do you need to end things, when do you need to have a one-on-one conversation, when do you need to just make sure that it's out on the table. Here are everyone's biases. Now make decisions with that knowledge, right? So since these are such complex issues, we have a couple of hypotheticals to discuss with you. I think we have time for, what do you think? Do we have time for a think, pair, share for each of them? And so we'll do a similar speaking in small groups and then coming back to share as a whole. Oh, yes.
Thank you so much, for your explanation. To me, I still have some difficulties to find the link between racism and conflict resolution based on what you have explained so far. Could we have like a specific example, clear example? Are we talking about conflict resolutions between groups, between countries, or are we talking about, just in a personal life? Because if I'm going in the subway and I see two people arguing based on racism, one of them is racist against the other, then I will not go as a facilitator there. I would just go and ask the guy to stop being racist. But if we're talking about conflict resolutions, my understanding is that, if we take the example of the UN, usually we take it as a facilitator when it comes to conflict resolutions. So can we have a specific example that, we're talking about when you become as a facilitator on conflict resolutions based on any conflict going on in the world, let's say, or between two groups, that where I could use these techniques or these steps as a facilitator to solve the problem between the two groups. Thank you.
So I think where we see it come up in conflict a lot is when we do our EEOC mediations, which often deal directly with potential racial discrimination. And so sometimes we've had issues of the party is claiming, there was bias in not being promoted or some other issue that arose at a government agency in the U.S. And we have seen microaggressions happen mainly in caucus that show that the person across the table from the person bringing forth this claim may have racial biases or just lack a certain racial sensitivity. So I think in that case, when that is specific, it's already on the table, right? Because it's a claim of racial discrimination. But other times you'll also just have people who, we had this example in the fall. I don't know if you remember this, Sky, where there was, it was a conflict between a man and a woman. This isn't race, gender, but similar principles apply. And the man kept making comments about women that, I don't remember the specific comments, but definitely discriminatory comments against women. And since we mediate in pairs, there was a female and a male mediator. And the party that was making these comments about women was trying to curry favor with the male mediator. So sometimes, I guess to answer your question, these are kind of vague, but to answer your question, we've seen it come up in our mediations when race is already on the table because it's a discrimination claim. And we've also seen it when race, gender, whatever the microaggressions are that come up are really not related to the conflict, but it provides information to the parties in terms of what biases is each party coming to the table with if it's not part of the conflict. Like, why was it necessary to talk about women in that way during the conflict when that wasn't part of the conflict, but some people just will. And like our professor, oh, yes, we have great. What? I was just going to say, wait, sorry, I lost my train of thought. It's good to know who's across from you, as you were saying earlier, right? So I think we've seen it come up when it's already on the table or also when you wouldn't expect race or another bias to come up. Parties bring their own biases to the table, so it's important for conflict resolution because whether the conflict is about race or not, people come to the table with biases, and it's good to put them out there and have those as part of the discussion. And then you can comment. So make sure you...
Okay. My issue is the strategies for exiting, right? Because the point is to resolve the conflict. So if you leave, and we're talking about antiracism, so there's the conflict, it's about racist behavior or, impact. So when, as a mediator, that's how I understand it, so maybe this is, you correct me, but me, let's say I'm a facilitator or a mediator, and I find that the situation is difficult to handle, and you see that the, let's say, racist party doesn't seem to change, me leaving can make it worse, right? So I want to understand, like, is it me leaving or finding another solution or, a party or a facilitator that will be able to solve this issue? Because now you come into a situation when that person that is marginalized is left alone, right? And the racist party is winning. I don't know. I'm oversimplifying the situation, but I'm trying to make it more practical and piggyback on what he was saying, right?
Let's see, from Victoria? Okay, let's see. Sure, speak it out loud, yeah.
On the chat from Victoria, she's asking, when engaging in a conflict resolution where race or bias is a perceived factor, as a facilitator, do you acknowledge the tension at the beginning before the conversation begins? Or do you wait until potentially offensive language is introduced and the conversation to begin the stroking/discouraging of the language?
So I think a lot of the questions right now are very useful in illuminating that there is no clear one instance that we're talking about. We're talking about a multitude of circumstances where this might come up. To the question that was just raised, I think if you know that some kind of bias is integral to the conversation you are having before you even start the conversation, then that's going to be acknowledged at the outset. It's part of what everyone has come together to discuss. It's an agreed part of that process. In some respects, I think that's much easier than when some kind of racism or bias comes up that was unexpected or that was not something that the parties themselves realized was going to be part of the conversation. So to answer the person online, I think if you know that's there coming in, that should be something that's part of the conversation coming in. It's the fullest way to bring that in. We've also heard some questions about the exiting the process. I think it's really important to say that exiting for the sake of the neutral is not what we're suggesting here. We're suggesting that the neutral employ a variety of other tools and techniques, which we've named but have not gone into in great depth because this format simply doesn't allow for that. But those tools and techniques should be used before an exit strategy is put in place to try to surface what's going on for the parties, to ensure that the party who is the victim of the racism, for example, is making informed and useful choices about how they can participate in this process, to solicit support for that person if that's something that they want and need, to see whether or not to test out the views, I'm going to call it, of the racist person. You know, are these deeply held beliefs? Is this something that's a matter of that can be corrected by some kind of coaching or training, or are you dealing with somebody who's really putting forward deeply held beliefs that are integral to this process? I also want to just say that it's going to very much depend on where you are and what supports are available. There are going to be certain situations where the neutral, the facilitator, can connect the person who's being victimized with some kind of support outside of that process. There are going to be certain situations as mediators, for example, for the cases that this clinic handles, we don't have an advocacy role and we're not associated with larger organizations. So what we can do is protect the sanctity of the process that the parties have agreed to enter into, and to say, if it turns out that there's no way to effectively facilitate the conversation that the parties were saying they wanted to have, to let them know that we can't offer more protection and support for somebody who is being victimized by that process. That in some respects may feel inadequate. I think sometimes it feels inadequate to us, but it also is the reality of that situation. And so by pretending we can facilitate more when we can't do that safely, it's again a detriment to the party who is being the subject of that racist attack. But I think it is very context dependent, and hopefully many of you are going to be facilitating conversations within this larger umbrella of the UN, and there may be infinitely more resources that you can direct parties to who are being victimized or continuing to be victimized as part of that facilitation process.
Yeah, because I think that was a great point about what if leaving the table is not possible, right? And I think for us, usually it's, well, we send it back to the court, and very extreme things would have to happen for us to end the mediation as the mediator. But if we do feel that the mediation process versus the court process is not going to allow for the protection, then we leave it to the court. But I think you raise a good question in terms of another question for the facilitator is there another process that this can be referred to that could deal with these dynamics better? And if there's not, then, right, that's part of your evaluation in terms of whether you continue. So it's like, what is part of your question is what is questioning as a facilitator in terms of continuing is, well, what is the alternative, and is the alternative better? And if there's not, then you're right. That goes into potentially you having to plow forward and continue to use the tools we've discussed to continue the conversation, even with the racial language behaviors, et cetera. So I'm going to turn it to Brenton to introduce our first hypo.
All right, thank you, Sonia Helen. So for these hypos, you all can take about, 2 or 3 minutes to discuss with those around you, and then we'll just take some hands. So the first hypothetical deals with direct assertions of racial bias or discrimination. A junior member of your team approaches you about feelings of racial discrimination relating to promotion opportunities and general treatment by her direct workplace supervisor. The junior team member is the only person on the team who identifies as a member of the ethnic minority of the country. Her supervisor states that she has been treated fairly and that her lack of promotional opportunities are the result of her poor work product and poor teamwork. The supervisor only wants to talk about data points and refuses to directly engage in conversation about the race claim. So if you all can discuss with those around you about two minutes or so, and then we'll come back. And those on Zoom, please feel free to comment, or on WebEx, please feel free to comment, raise your hand, and we'll try to take some of your hands and comments as well. Okay. Okay. All right, so you all can start discussing now, and we'll come back. Can you go to the next slide? Can you go to the next slide? Oh. I have it here. I'll talk about it. All right. All right. We'll go ahead and come back together now. I can hear great conversation around me, so thank you all for participating. So now we'll go ahead and I'll go ahead and take some hands, whether in the room or if you want to chat on WebEx. Please feel free to comment. Yeah.
No, just okay. Cool. Okay, so I'll chime in by summing up some of the comments, suggestions we've had in the WebEx chat. And if anyone wants to raise their hand to speak as well from WebEx, that is always an option as well. So we've had some questions about, is involving HR a good idea as opposed to shouldering the responsibility of implementing the company policy as a team leader in this situation? So I think this represents that, thought should be given to who should be in charge of implementing the solution. Should a flat structure be used, whereas many people with expertise should be involved in a corporate landscape to flesh out the issue? So again, who is implementing the solution here and who is thinking about this? We've also had some notes about whether this should be a one-on-one or a joint discussion. Julie said that the pros of a joint discussion is that there's a third party involved who can witness to the conversation and help to mediate the conversation so that it stays on target and help to manage emotions as well as helping guide proper language. But I believe also we had someone say that one-on-one decision could be good and bad in that it can allow other personal points to be brought up, but at the same time introduce the aspect of ethnocentrism. And then also there was a discussion about gender. And let's see, what else? Yep, gender bias. And someone outlined what they thought the pros for one-on-one discussion was versus the cons. So Rashid said, allows for more candid conversations, may make participants more comfortable sharing sensitive information, but also lacks direct communication between the parties and might not address misunderstandings as effectively. Whereas joint discussion also has pros and cons. So I think after reading through the chat, some of the main things we have coming up is who are the stakeholders involved in this conversation and also in the conversation between the parties, but also in terms of implementing the solution. When should you go to joint discussion versus one-on-one? Seems that here there could be pros, for each in terms of one-on-one people express things they wouldn't in a group, but also then the parties might not understand each other as well. And then also talking about intersectionality as brought up before between race and gender. Any other hands? Oh, yes. Okay. Anyone in the room have any thoughts, anything that came up when speaking in your small groups in terms of how you would approach this hypo or how you could employ the tools we've already discussed to deal with this difficult situation? Yes, Lee.
So I unfortunately don't have anything to say in terms of the tools because we mostly talked about all the dead ends that we feared we would run into. If one party is saying they don't have a bias, it's a little difficult to bring that bias to light, especially if the party on the receiving end doesn't want to say it or says it and then is shot down. So we talked a lot about how the data points that the manager has are subjective, work product is subjective, or even if you bring up objective data points, you can kind of pick and choose those. So we talked a lot about just the difficulties of even bringing the bias to light in the first place. One of the solutions we potentially came up with was moving to a one-on-one conversation, but even in the one-on-one conversation, most people have a pretty vested interest in saying, no, of course I'm not biased here. So that's what we spend most of our time talking about.
Yeah, and I think to your points in terms of potentially running into a dead end. It's just going to depend on the parties. It's kind of like when we go into a mediation and we don't know who the parties are, what their personalities are like. Sometimes you think people will be shut down, but they're actually more willing to discuss their emotions, or vice versa, right? So that's why the tools we're discussing today are so flexible, because it is going to depend not only on just the facilitator and their skills, but also on the parties and what they're willing to bring to the table, and how upfront they're willing to be about their emotions and also what happened. So I think that brings up a good point, that it's so party dependent. Yes.
Okay, thank you. But yes, it's a difficult situation indeed, what like she mentioned, because when I was mentioning before, the beginning is the power dynamic, right? So you're a facilitator in this situation, but there will be some repercussion if that manager, supervisor doesn't agree or is open to see the consequences, like to see the bias, the racial bias, right? So I think that's what's missing maybe in the hypothesis, right? So, and depending also of the culture of the company or whatsoever. So yes, you come into a situation, there's a clear bias they don't want to listen to, but what is it only to make them aware that they're racist, or if you're not open to this is what will happen to you as a supervisor? Because that's not what I saw in this hypothesis, right? So, yeah, that's what I wanted to add to the situation.
Right, so that's another variable that, again, the hypo is intentionally vague because this could have, the outcome could depend on the structures, the institutional structures in place, not just the parties and their attitudes towards this discussion, but right, like what structures does the company have in place to deal with these types of conversations and prevent retaliation? So I think that's a good point. Both it's interpersonal and structural, multifaceted, et cetera. And so just seeing the time, we won't have time to get to our next hypo before wrapping up. The next hypo was about having, it talked about having right stakeholders at the table, like someone had brought up in the chat. So I just wanted to put it up on the screen and show that, we had a hypo that was more in a workplace setting and 2 individuals, whereas this is 2 groups. And the same tools can be used there, but also with thinking about which stakeholders are in the room even before the conversation starts would be part of the discussion here. And any other? Oh, yeah. So something we brought up here are there any biases that you would have to acknowledge, similar to this hypo 1? How would you proceed? Think about the tools. And then how does your solution for this hypo differ from hypo 1? And I think part of it is that, right, you're dealing with 2 groups here. And so that would be a big part of the difference in how you facilitate this discussion. Anything else, Brenton, to add? I think we also talked about, joint, maybe this needing to have a joint discussion first to have everything out on the table for the 2 groups, right? So people know maybe what biases are going into this discussion.
All right. Yes. This scenario is probably a better situation for a joint discussion, as Sonia Helen said. At this time, since we have a couple minutes left, we'll take some last questions. If anybody has any last comments or questions that they like to share, we can maybe take a couple of those and then conclude.
So thank you, everyone. We hope that this was useful to start to get you thinking about some of the tools that were mentioned and about the possible applicability of those tools in all of the spaces in which you might be doing conflict resolution or peace-building work. We appreciate all of your active participation, the folks on WebEx, the folks that were here, and we are delighted. If you have any feedback, we're always retooling these presentations. Please feel free to be in touch with us in the days to come through Pelayo or through Marco. We're happy to hear more about how this landed with you, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks, I think, for the next presentations. Thank you so much.